to another video here on Free Will Photos. Today we're going to be using ON1 Photo Raw to enhance a straight photo of a painting or a mural. So this is the end result, and this is what we started with. So let me go ahead and reset this, and we're going to dive right into the edit. So as you can tell, the very first thing that's different with this image is the crop. I'm going to go ahead and hit the letter C on the keyboard. That brings up the crop tool. I use the diagonals personally, so I'm just going to pull down on here until I get the diagonals essentially going across this particular centerpiece, because I want to focus on the overall mural in this shot, because that is the hero, so to speak. So I think that this gets us pretty close to where I think it should be. Let's go ahead and rotate that until it gets level. As you can see, it wasn't completely level. I literally took this as I was walking by and said, oh, look, that's kind of cool. So just got to play around with the crop here a little bit, but I'm looking for balance. That's all that I'm really looking for. Nothing overly crazy. So for the sake of the tutorial, I'm just going to crop this in pretty good, and may not be the original crop that I had on the other photo, but still something very similar. So we're going to go ahead and hit apply. So that way this crop is applied to the image, and it looks a little off center, and that's going to bother me. So let me go back to my crop tool for just a second and pull this over. And now I think it looks better. So I could work with this. I could live with this. And this is our base canvas size, if you will. Now, what I like to do in all of my photos is play around with the camera profile. And I say all very loosely, but I think portrait is the camera profile that fits the best for this image, just because it takes it from that dark and gloomy type of image, turns it into something that is a little bit more open, if you will. I like that. Now, if I pull down on the exposure, you can see I have a little bit of detail in the sky, so we need to recover the sky. But instead of modifying anything over here on the develop module, I want to go straight to local adjustments, because this is where I'm going to enhance the tones in the overall image. Now, what I like to do is invert the mask. In the past, you guys have heard me talk about the Elgato Stream Deck. There's a full video coming, but I decided to put a little bit of overlay of the Elgato mappings that I use. So I actually have an invert mask button on my Elgato here. When I push that, it inverts the entire mask, which is super helpful. So that way I don't have to click the mask, click invert, and do all that, or use a keyboard shortcut that I'll forget. That's the reason why I use the Elgato. If you got questions about that, let me know in the comment section. Now, getting back to the edit, what I'm doing is only looking at the sky. So I'm just going to pull down on this until I get a decent look in the sky. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, because I need to mask out the sky now. Now, you could use the AI tool, but I want something that's going to be a little bit more precise. So what I'm going to do is use the line masking tool, which I also have mapped on my Elgato. So it just essentially does the keyboard shortcut for me, switched me over to the line mask tool, and I am going to very quickly and loosely paint this line mask. You should definitely take the time with your photo, but for tutorial purposes and just showing you like ideas of how you can mask out things, especially stuff like this where it's a straight line, it's not complicated to get this masking option completed. So all you have to do is take a little bit of time, and boom, just like that, I have my mask set. Now, what I want to do is paint in this particular effect, or actually, I want to paint this away, because remember, I inverted my mask. So what I need to do is come up here to the top and select paint out, And then what I want to do is paint this away from everything that's not inside of this mask. So instead of inside of the line mask, I want to come over to the buildings and click there. It's going to take away the edit from everywhere that isn't inside of this line mask. Now I have too much of a feather on here, so I'm going to pull down the feather until it gets tighter to those buildings. Maybe give it a 1 pixel feather. And what I like to do is pull these into the building just a little bit. It's okay if the building gets a little bit of this adjustment. For me personally, I don't get too nitpicky when it comes to these things because there's so many ways that I could work to blend this in. And I don't think many people are going to pay that much attention to the sky or the edges, as long as, you know, you don't get like obvious halos, right? If I have something that looks like this, they're going to pay attention. But if I have something that looks like this, and then I just pull this down and it comes over the edges, you can always go across it with a brush as well and clean up this mask. But I'm not going to do that today because that is very meticulous and time consuming. And I don't think that that would be entertaining for anyone to watch. That would almost be a punishment. And I'm just trying to grab this corner. So that way we'll call that good. And I'm just going to hit done. Hit Command 0 to zoom out. And now I have fully recovered that sky back there. And I think it looks pretty good. So rename this adjustment sky. And we'll move on to another adjustment because I don't want to do anything else. Actually, I take that back. I do want to pull down on the blue tones so we get a little bit of a more blue sky and then pull up on the vibrance. And that just helps with the way that the sky overall looks, right? Could have used sky or mask AI, but I just decided to do it manually, because that's my style of editing. So now what I need to do is figure out what am I going to do with all of this light in the background, because obviously I need to do what's known as a key shift, which is taking the bright areas and turning them dark and taking the dark areas and turning them bright. Now, there are a ton of ways that you could address this. I personally will use a very straightforward and simple method, which is manually masking essentially. So what I'm going to do is invert my mask again by pressing my invert button. And then I am going to just pull this down until I get something that is almost matching with what the sky looks like. Now, right now, I am applying this to the sky. So what I want to do is come over to this particular mask, and again on my Elgato I have a copy mask button, so if I push that, it's going to copy the mask. And then if I come over to this adjustment, I have a paste mask button, and then that allows me to paste the mask. Well, now that I have the new mask, what I want to do is invert it. So I hit the invert button, and now I'm only applying this in areas where the sky is not. I know I went really fast there, but if you got questions, just let me know in the comment section. I do answer those questions. So now what I'm going to do is modify this light until it starts to make sense with what's going on in the sky. It doesn't have to be perfect because I'm going to put a pretty good vignette over the entire image. I just know that. That's a style that I like to do, especially when I have center weighted subjects or subjects in the center of my frame. So I think that's going to do pretty well because I do want to show that this is still in shadow. So I don't want to get rid of all of that. I just want to make it look a little bit more dramatic. So if I turn this off and on, you can kind of see that I'm recovering those details. And maybe I'll even add in just a touch of structure here. And we'll call this, and actually I also want to remove it from this particular structure. So what I'm going to do is hit the refine button, which gives me my refine tool, or you could just hit the letter N, doesn't really matter. And then I also have my Tourbox Neo right here in the frame. I think it's in the frame. And this is another tool that I use to help me with making my edits. Now, again, I'm just going to do a rough cut of this. You've seen me use the encircling tool many times now, so this shouldn't look like something new. But if it is your first time catching a video here on Free Will Photos and you're like, I have no idea what he's doing, well, welcome, first of all. And second, check the video library on my page, especially around the release of this particular video. I have a lot of videos about how I'm using the encircling tool because I use it on pretty much all of my edits. So essentially what I did is I took that darkening effect away from this area. If I hit the letter O on my keyboard, you can see what I have taken out of the mask in red, essentially. So if it's in red, that means that it's not getting any of the effect. This doesn't have to be perfect for my personal workflow, but I could definitely come in here and clean this up. Again, I'm not going to do that today because I think that will take way too long. And now we're going to label this BG dark, or you could even put burn if you want to use the technical term for dodging and burning. So now it's time to really start working on this mural and bringing that to life. So I'm going to hit add adjustment. And because I just want to work on the mural itself, I'm going to use the line mask tool. And I am going to make a really generic rectangle here, or following the shape of this particular mural, if you will. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Again, you definitely want to take the time to make your masks as good as you need them to be. But what I found in ON1 is for photographers, we don't really need these extremely precise masks in most cases, because the way that we're modifying the photo is in general terms. So as long as it gets a good portion of the area, and then we have a way of tapering those edges to make it look more natural, I think that looks a little bit better in my own personal opinion. So what I want to do is paint this effect in to this area by clicking inside of the mask this time. And I'll pull up on the feather here just about 3 pixels. We'll go with 4 since it stopped there. Now, that's obviously the opposite of what I want to do. So what I'm going to do is pull up on the exposure here. And you can see I'm bringing back the light detail in this area, even though this was all shot inside a shadow. Now, you want to be careful when you start to bring up shadowed areas. And that's because, one, you can introduce noise. But 2, you can also introduce like color fringing and weird artifacts. But the other thing that you want to do is pay attention to your black point in the shadowed area that you're bringing up, because you start to lose contrast. Now, I've talked about this in previous videos, but what I do is I pull down on my black point, pull up on my white point, and that introduces contrast in very precise increments. You can use the contrast slider, and this makes decisions for you, which, you know, a little bit of the contrast slider goes a long way. But when you start messing with your black point, you can really hone in how you want that contrast to look. Now, for this particular image, I know that I need to bring the shadows up quite a bit, which means I need to bring down my black point a little bit more and bring up my white point. So that way I'm really building in that contrast. So if I turn this off and turn it back on, you can see I'm really starting to hone in this, this overall effect. Now, I've also included in my mask this top part that says in. Well, I don't really care to have that getting all of these effects. So what I'm going to do is actually remove that from the mask. So all you have to do is go back to the line masking tool, as long as I have that selected. And then if I hover over it, I get this line again. So if I click on the line, I now get to modify this. So all I'm going to do is pull this down to this corner here and pull this down to this corner here, give or take. And now you can see that I'm not actually editing that particular piece. So I'll hit done and I'm good with that. Now what I will do, because I think that it does need a little bit of a edit, like to open up the light and help this with the transition, is I'll grab my brush tool and I will, with a very low opacity, probably something around like 30. And this is just me eyeballing, right? I'm going to take my mouse and click once to paint in, and I'm just going to build this up until I think that it's where I want it to be. All right, this is completely subjective, bringing out just a little bit of detail, but not enough to distract from the main focus of the image, which is this mural or this painting. So that's just my personal creative process. And I think that that works, right? So now I've gone from something that looks like this to something that looks a little bit more interesting, like so. Now, what I also want to do on this particular painting is bring out some of the vibrancy and the color in it. So I'm going to pull up on the vibrancy here, and you can see that just brings its own level of color and interest. And then I'm going to pull up on the saturation as well, because I want those colors to really pop. Now, I've also talked about this in the past. What you may want to do, let me just rename this real quick. Painting. Okay. So what you may want to do is something known as contrast separation or color separation. I could do this in one of two ways. I'm going to use the easier method because I get a little bit more control. I'm going to go with effects, and I'm going to add a black and white filter. Now, everything turns black and white. I don't want that. I want this area here to stay just as I made it. So what I need to do is go back to my line masking tool and just make a rough paint job or rough line estimate around my mural here. And again, this doesn't have to be extra perfect, because the goal here is just to take away some of the saturation in the background. So I'm going to click on I'm going to paint the effect, the black and white effect, away from this particular area just by clicking in the center there. So now I've achieved the look of removing the black and white filter from that area. And now what I'm going to do is just pull down on the opacity until I start to get that color back in the background. And I'll stop somewhere around there because I think that this is working. So I'll leave it like so. And then what I'm going to do, these buildings over here are more in the red tone, so I'll make them a little bit darker, so that way they get a little bit more richness, and we'll even darken down the sky just a little bit more. So I'm really making creative decisions, but separating the colors so that way the background doesn't look as interesting as the foreground element here. So now I can come back to my local adjustments, and I'm going to do one last thing to really make this painting pop. And that is pull up on the exposure, pull up on the structure here, and I think even a little bit of the midtones. And what I'm going to do is make my brush size a little bit larger. I'm going to click here, here, and down here. And all that does is makes a tonal variation inside of the subject area, right? So if I turn it off, you can see that it's not as interesting. It's very subtle, and that's the whole point here. But when I turn it back on, it really helps make this mural pop out of the photo and look a little bit more three-dimensional. So then the last thing that I will do is add a dynamic contrast. And I know whenever I say the last thing that I'll do in my videos, usually doesn't really mean much of anything. But let me go ahead and copy this particular mask, and then we'll paste it onto the dynamic contrast, and we'll invert it. So now I have this really popping. Now that's a little more than what I think it should have. So I'll pull this back and then turn this off and turn it back on. And that just helps with the overall grittiness, I think. And now it is time to put my vignette on. So what I'm going to do is grab my local adjustment, hit the masking bug icon on my Elgato, and then I'm just going to click right here in the center, and that puts a vignette around everything, around the center area, and puts the darkening effect on everything else. So as I pull this in, because it's okay if I darken some of the corners to this particular centerpiece. Now I have my overall photo looking, like it's focusing in more. I'll feather this out a little bit. It's focusing in more on that center piece, so to speak, of the mural. Now, what I also like to do is give some sort of a leading line into the overall image. So I'm going to add another local adjustment. And this time I'm going to use the line masking tool again. It just works so well for these types of things. I'm going to click at the corner of the base of the mural, click off, come out at a diagonal, click off the screen or off the photo, and then do it again over here, and then close this right there. And what I want to do is a paint in effect. So I'm going to click inside of the actual line mask. And then I want the feather here to go up quite a bit because I want this to blend pretty well. So I'll hit done. And right now I'm getting the opposite of the effect that I want. So I'm going to pull up on the exposure here. And then I'm going to open up my mask icon, and I'm going to pull up on the feather. And this is just going to disperse that over the ground a lot more evenly, right? So you can see how the photo is kind of leading you in from the bottom, even though there's nothing really interesting down here. And if I wanted to make that a little bit more interesting, I could probably throw in some contrast, maybe lower the black point, open up some shadow, and then maybe even increase the structure. So now it looks a little bit more interesting down there. But I don't want to take away too much from the overall painting, so I'll pull this down to about there. And I think that that looks pretty good. So we've literally gone from something that looks like this to something that looks like this using just local adjustments and a few effects. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. Hopefully you found value in today's content. If you did, smash the like button. If you're new here, consider subscribing. My name's Chris. I create content centered around ON1 Photo Raw and other photo editing applications. And my goal is to just help photographers get their creative vision out and into the world. If you don't have ON1 Photo Raw and you want to save some money on your purchase of the program, consider using the coupon code FreeWillPhotos20 to save 20% when you check out. If you want to connect with me, check me out on Vero. I'm over there. I'm posting as frequently as I'm editing photos. So with all that said, until the next time, I want you to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.